Hi, good afternoon. Thanks very much for joining all of us here for a very, very special lecture today. That's the Agrawal Endowed lecture. And before we introduce our esteemed speaker, just a few logistics. One is that we can engage your questions and have you post them using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen. And you can do this as the lecture is proceeding, and we will be taking answers to these in a sequential manner following the lecture. But also, if you would like to pose the questions directly in person, you can also use the hands up feature, and we'll unmute you, and you can directly ask the question to our presenter. And but on the other hand, if you have any technical issues, please use the chat function, and Allison or Kelsey will touch base with you to make sure that you can join us successfully. Just a little background on the Agrawal Endowed Lectureship before I introduce our speaker. So the Agrawal Lectureship was established back in 2009 by Anand and Saroj Aggarwal in recognition of the Heart Institute as a leader in cardiac care and also in research. Mr. Agrawal joined the Heart Institute Foundation Board back in 2002, and with his wife Saroj, they are really great supporters of research, and through their activities at the board and also their leadership in the Indo-Canadian community, they have really continued to raise funds to support the Heart Institute and also various research endeavors. And we've been actively examining the cardiovascular health of South Asian Indo-Canadian community. This community is already known to have higher incidence of heart disease. And in fact, according to a recent publication by our teams, that there is 3 times the risk of hypertension in the South Asian population, accompanied by increased disproportionate burden of cardiovascular disease. And given the fact that the South Asians account for 1/4 of the world's population, and it is the largest ethnic group in Canada, these findings have major global implications as well as for health in Canadians. And so Endowed Lectureship is a fund that enables us annually to bring the world's foremost experts in cardiovascular medicine and in this domain to actually enlighten us and to promote formal exchange. And this year, we're absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Alka Kanaya, who I really actually wanted to invite for a long time, who's a professor of medicine, epidemiology, and biostatistics at the University of California, San Francisco. And Dr. Kanaya has focused her research previously on type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and particularly in terms of prevention and understanding, in particular, the risks that the Asian American population and the health disparities that I actually face over the last 2 decades. She's leading the mediators of atherosclerosis in South Asians living in America. That's the MASALA study. And to better understand the factors that explain the high rates of diabetes and heart disease in this particular population. And in fact, this is the only longitudinal study of South Asians in the US. She has held multiple R01s from an NIH, including on additional interesting topics on biomarkers, metabolic effects, heart failure in South Asia is my favorite area, social cultural factors and resilience in South Asian immigrants, and also effect of yoga on metabolic syndrome. She's also practicing internist and leads the CTSI research training programs at UCSF. So we are absolutely delighted to have Dr. Kanaya here today. We anxiously look forward to this year's Agrawal lecture and on the topic of cardiometabolic disease in South Asians, key findings from the MASALA study. Thank you so much, Dr. Kanaya.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here. I wish we were in person, Dr. Liu, but I really thank you for this honor and privilege to speak with you all, to share our findings, and I hope we can engage in some dialogue towards the end of this talk. And I do thank the Aggarwal family for sponsoring this lectureship, and hope we can meet face-to-face someday. So I'm going to spend about 45 minutes just showing you kind of our key findings from the MASALA study focusing on cardiometabolic disease in South Asians. So who are South Asians? They include about 1.8 billion individuals who live in the countries on the subcontinent from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, the Maldives and Bhutan, but they also include the diaspora. And this is a nice graph that shows you the different waves of immigration, starting with the UK first, and then newer waves of immigration to Canada and the US, and more recently to Australia and Finland, on New Zealand, as well as smaller waves of immigration in other parts of the world. And so the overall, community of South Asians, the diaspora, is almost 1.9 billion people, or 24% of the world's population. So I think the findings that we have from any study, from any part of the diaspora, does lend a nice lens into thinking about risk for these individuals. So why study South Asians? There are data like this from all around the world, cross-sectional data, as well as some prospective data that show that the 10-year incidence of heart disease is highest among South Asians. So this comes from Northern California Kaiser, an integrated health delivery system in California. And what they did was to look at overall men and women together, and then in orange men separately from women in gray. And then they looked at who developed heart disease in 10 years of follow-up. And you'll see the South Asian bars are highest, regardless of if it's for men or women, for both, compared to all other race ethnic groups, including East Asians, other Asians, Blacks, Hispanic, white, and multi-ethnic populations. And this has been seen over and over again around the world, but there are very few longitudinal cohort studies to really dive deep into looking at multi-level risk factors, why this is happening and what's modifiable, what can we do to prevent this? And that was really the crux of why we did the MASALA study. So the aims of this study are to establish a prospective community-based cohort of South Asians in the United States to look at multi-level risk factors, traditional, sociocultural, behavioral, and novel risk factors that are associated with subclinical atherosclerosis, which is a proximate, easy to measure endpoint in a study, and then to compare these risk factors with 4 different race ethnic groups in the United States by partnering with an ongoing study called Multi-Ethnic Study of Atherosclerosis. I'll show you more about that. And the long-term goal is really to investigate factors that are associated with incident cardiovascular disease, or what predicts the development of cardiovascular disease. So the way we designed MASALA was to be parallel in the methods and all the measures to the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis. We chose a slightly lower age eligibility criterion, starting at 40 to 84 rather than 45. And that's because we know that South Asians develop cardiovascular disease earlier than other ethnic groups. In our first grant, we had enough funding to just recruit 900 South Asians in the US. And we used the same criteria, that they had to have no existing cardiovascular disease, because we're looking at what predicts the antecedents of cardiovascular disease. So we excluded people who had had any procedures on their heart or blood vessels, any stroke, any myocardial infarction or heart failure. And to be in the study, you had to self-identify as South Asian. We have 2 study sites, one at my university in San Francisco and one at Northwestern University in Chicago. And our baseline exam started in 2010. We completed exam 2 in 2018, and we just started exam 3 this month. And MESA was a much larger study, is a much larger study. They had 4 race ethnic groups, which is a great comparison to the South Asians in our study. They include people from 6 different sites, so Northwestern being our one similar site, but they have a site in New York City, in Baltimore, Minnesota, Los Angeles, and in North Carolina. They started 10 years before MASALA, and they completed exam 6 when we completed exam 2. So here's a study timeline to show you what we've done so far in MASALA. So this was the baseline exam, and we brought people in, and it was a random sample of South Asians living around the San Francisco Bay Area or the greater Chicago area. And we brought them in for almost 6 hours of phenotyping. We did fasting blood test, a glucose tolerance test, coronary calcium CT of the heart, carotid ultrasounds and EKGs, and we included 906 participants. We received new grants to map their social networks. I don't have time to go into some of the great, interesting findings that we have seen with the social network study. And then we received new funding to bring everyone back to do repeat tests to look at change over 5 years' time. And about 83% of our participants came back in. We received a little bit of philanthropic funding to increase the sample of our cohort and added another 258 participants then. And this summer, we received a new grant to bring people back for a third exam focusing on heart function, really looking at different stages of heart failure and looking at vascular stiffness and endothelial function. We just started this exam 3 this month. We hope we'll have some findings by 2023. And at the same time, we received new funding to enlarge our cohort, adding in 1,150 new participants who are immigrants from Bangladesh and Pakistan to really increase the numbers of people in all 3 of the biggest South Asian countries so that we have enough numbers to compare across countries of origin. So our cohort will be going from 1,150 to 2,300 in the next few years. We're very excited to have the ability to expand the cohort. So here's a roadmap of what I'll be speaking about in the next half hour or so. I'm going to show you our participant characteristics and then show you some of the interesting data that we've analyzed about diet. Everyone has their favorite, risk factor, and a lot of people put all their money on its dietary issues that are driving this high risk of heart disease. I'll show you some really interesting provocative data on acculturation, as well as psychological factors that may be associated with heart disease as well. And then the rest of the talk will really focus in on body composition, diabetes, and atherosclerosis, looking at coronary artery calcium. So who are the people in our study? 98% are immigrants to the United States, and a majority come from India, about 83%. Only 6% come from Pakistan, and then 1% from other South Asian countries, and 2% were born in the US. Again, looking at the age demographics of our study, age 40 to 84, the immigration wave in the US really started in the mid-1960s. So for people to immigrate in the 60s and to be eligible for the study, there's only a small minority of South Asians in the US who are in the age range of 40 or over if they were born in the US. And this is really why we needed more participants who are born in Pakistan and Bangladesh to be able to do meaningful subgroup analyses looking at different effects of environment and context and culture on risk factors. So in the study currently, we have a nice distribution of years in the US. About an average of 28 years of life have been lived in the US for our study participants, or about half of their life, and nice bell-shaped distribution so we can look at the effect of being a recent immigrant to being a long-term immigrant. Socioeconomic status and family income are high, and this is actually very similar to the US Census data, because the reasons that South Asians were allowed to immigrate in the 1960s onwards was because of the immigration laws in the US that only allowed people who were seeking higher education or had professional degrees to come to the US. So as a result, the Asian Indian population in the US is highly educated, and you can see that reflected in our study. 64% of men had a greater than bachelor's degree, 47% of women, and family income tracks with that. In later waves of immigration, there's been family reunification, as well as other waves of immigration that are not associated with education. So we do have a smaller proportion of people with, lower socioeconomic status. But, this is a limitation in our study, that we really can't look at the effect of socioeconomic status because it is skewed to the right so much. So what about behavior? So I'm going to show you some comparisons to MESA, and I'm orienting you to how this will be shown. So South Asians will be the first column, and then the 4 race ethnic groups in MESA, our sister study, are whites, Blacks, Latinos, and Chinese Americans. And I've taken out the 40 to 45-year-olds in this comparison so that we're comparing apples to apples. And we always sex and age adjust these results so that, again, we're comparing apples to apples. So what about lifestyle behaviors? South Asians had very low prevalence of current smoking, almost as low as the Chinese in MESA. The other 3 race ethnic groups in MESA had a higher prevalence of current smoking. Alcohol use was also fairly low to modest in the 2 Asian subgroups in MASALA and MESA. And exercise, unfortunately, was abysmally low among South Asians. And this is a cumulative measure based on a self-reported 4-page questionnaire that looks at leisure time physical activities, occupational, volunteer, every kind of activity from low intensity yoga to all the way up to high intensity activities. But you can see that the South Asians who are highly educated and have high income were the least likely to have high exercise compared to all 4 groups in MESA. So very low hanging fruit in terms of modifiable risk factor. So what about diet? A lot of people really want to, think about South Asian diets and some culprit issues that may be driving this. It's very complicated to measure South Asian foods because it depends on what region, what state, what province of South Asia you come from. The diets are very different from, typical, very highly vegetarian diets to very mixed diets, different ways of cooking. So what we did to try to get a hold of this and a handle of this is we used a food frequency questionnaire that was developed in Canada by Sonia Anand's group in Hamilton, and that's the SHARE study, and it has 163 items. This was developed in South Asians in Canada, validated with 7-day food diaries. And we take all of this vast data, which of course, like all food frequency questionnaires, has problems with recall bias. It's only, so valid, but it really is the best tool we have for looking at the effects of diet and nutrition on risk factors. And what we've done is do different analyses to come up with dietary patterns, because people don't eat in terms of macronutrients, they eat in terms of the types of foods they eat in a diet. And so what we found are there are 3 major dietary patterns, and it's almost a third of our population who are eating these diets. One is a diet that's rich in animal protein, so more of a Western diet. The next is a fried snacks, sweets, and high-fat dairy diet, more of a traditional South Asian diet with a lot of both high-fat as well as a high-carbohydrate diet. And then the third is more of a prudent diet with fruits, vegetables, nuts, and legumes. Now you look at these diets and say, well, this one looks like a vegetarian diet more, and this one looks possibly a vegetarian. Both of these diets had about 50% vegetarian. So there are meats in these diets, but not as high a proportion of people eating meats as in the animal protein diet, which was 90% people who are non-vegetarian. And so when we looked at the relationships between these diets and risk factors, we found that those eating the animal protein diet had higher waist circumference and higher weight and body mass index, whereas the people in this middle, more traditional South Asian diet had higher blood pressure and lower HDL and higher indices of insulin resistance, kind of driving risk of diabetes compared to the people in the reference diet. And so we wanted to, look at this, of course, prospectively, now that we have prospective data, and wanted to dive a little bit more into plant-based diets, because this is becoming the new way of thinking in terms of healthy cardiovascular diet. And so not all plant-based foods are healthy. And so we looked at the healthy foods that are more whole grains, fruits, vegetables, herbs, nuts and legumes, tea and coffee, versus less healthy plant-based foods. These are refined grains, fruit juices, starchy vegetables like potatoes, deep fried snacks, and sweets and desserts and coconut. And so when we categorize what people are eating into healthy plant-based versus less healthy plant-based foods and their associations, what we found was that the plant-based diet itself is not associated with having a fatty liver, but people eating a healthy plant-based diet had lower odds of having a fatty liver. And when we look at who developed diabetes 5 years later, people eating the healthy plant-based diet had a lower risk of developing incident diabetes as well. You can see that those eating the unhealthy plant-based diet, there was a trend towards being a higher risk, both for the odds of having fatty liver as well as the risk of developing diabetes, but it wasn't significant. So this gives us a little bit more understanding about the types of diets to promote in our South Asians, because just saying eat a plant-based diet or eat a vegetarian diet would put somebody in the middle group of those diets that I showed in the traditional South Asian diet, which actually is full of the less healthy types of plant-based foods. So a little bit deeper dive there. Let's move on to some of our findings about acculturation. And we used to think of the United States as a melting pot, but I think of it more as a quilt that every immigrant who comes to this country and their communities, are creating this patchwork that we have in the United States. And I think it's quite similar in Canada as well. So in MASALA, we actually took, kind of a broad lens in thinking about acculturation, and we asked 10 different types of questions, looking at multiple dimensions of acculturation: how long someone has lived in the US, of course, how proficient you are in English. That variable doesn't work very well in countries that were colonized by the United Kingdom. Of course, their English language proficiency is quite good, especially in immigrants who were immigrated here because of language, because of profession and education. So other variables like what foods are eaten at home, are they mostly South Asian? What about foods eaten outside the home? How frequently are people engaging in social, cultural, religious events? Frequency of shopping at South Asian markets. Who are the friends of the people in our study? Are they mostly South Asians? So we used all of these different variables, and we actually did some qualitative work to develop a new traditional cultural belief scale. And so what we did with all of this data, again, much like the food frequency data, which was 163 items, here we have 8 to 10 items. We took these together and we did a latent class analysis, coming up with 3 types of acculturation strategies. And this orange circle is people who are very traditional and South Asian in their beliefs. So that's the very orange part of this Venn diagram. So people who have not acculturated to having United States values or beliefs or traditions, but stayed very South Asian. And that would be called the separation class, separated from the dominant society. And about 23% of our study population is in the separation class. Then there's this large bicultural class, which has retained South Asian cultural beliefs, but also adopted some American beliefs, and that's called the integration class, with 54% of our study population. And then in that purple part of the Venn diagram, that is people who have really adopted mostly American beliefs and values and traditions and not retained much of the South Asian, and that's the assimilation class with another 24%. So let's look at these three classes in terms of cardiovascular risk. And what we found is that people in the separation class had a lot more depression symptoms, which of course, you know, just given the name separation class, there's a little bit more isolation and feeling more removed from others in your society by being separated. So more depression symptoms does seem to track with that. But what we found is people in the integration and the assimilation class, very highly assimilated, had lower cardiometabolic risk. Now, every other immigrant group that has immigrated to the US, Japanese, Mexicans, you know, almost every other group from any other diaspora, from any other country, has found that as people acculturate more to the Western traditions of the US, they become more obese, more diabetic, higher rates of heart disease, and these things kind of track with the more Westernized you become. But what we're finding here is lower cardiometabolic risk in the people who are assimilated as well as integrated. That's very interesting because that says that there's something about being very traditional that may not be so healthy. So let's look at this again with a marker of atherosclerosis, looking at carotid wall intima media thickness. This is the neck and the carotid artery, the head of the participant here. And what we do is we measure the near wall intima media thickness between the pink line and the blue line and the far wall. And the thicker this, this wall thickness, the higher the risk of future stroke. And so what we wanted to look at was acculturation with these atherosclerosis measures. And we found that people in the integration class, the people in the moderate traditional cultural beliefs, actually had lower carotid intima media thickness after adjusting for all traditional cardiovascular risk factors and behaviors like physical activity, dietary intake, cholesterol medication use, years lived in the US. So there's something independent about being in this integration class that seems to be more protective, which seems to go beyond physical activity and diet. So possibly other stressors that may be coming from holding on and retaining traditional beliefs may be driving this. So very provocative finding. This is cross-sectional. We are doing more work looking at prospective issues now. So turning a little bit to psychological factors in atherosclerosis, we've looked at many different scales, including anger, anxiety, depression, and again, using carotid intima media thickness as the outcome measure here. What we found is that there's a little gender difference in what we're finding. And for men, higher levels of anxiety and depression were associated with higher carotid intima media thickness values. And this is after accounting for all other traditional cardiovascular risk factors, diet and exercise. So something independent about the effect of anxiety and depression with greater carotid intima media thickness. And for women, it was stress. It was current stress that was the driver for carotid intima media thickness, again, after adjusting for other risk factors. So I do think that this is, again, another modifiable risk factor that we can, think about and operationalize in terms of prevention of cardiovascular disease. So let's move on to talking a little bit more about body size and weight. As you all know, the WHO has proposed different criteria for Asians in terms of BMI, using the surrogate measure of BMI for overweight and obesity. In Asians, normal weight goes to a BMI of 22.9, overweight is 23 to 27.5, and obese is greater than or equal to 27.5. I don't know how much luck you have in Canada of physicians and providers actually using the WHO Asian cut points operationally in clinic. We don't have a very good handle of this and of people, of providers doing this in the US. So we're really trying to push our providers to use the correct BMI cut points in terms of thinking about who's at risk of cardiometabolic disease. So when we use the correct cut points and we categorize people in MESA and MASALA, shown in red here, into BMI categories of normal weight, overweight, or obese, just looking at the South Asians, they're about intermediate in terms of normal weight. About 25% of our population was normal BMI, less than 23. You can see the Chinese in MESA had 40% in the normal BMI range. The other groups were somewhat lower or higher. Overweight was almost uniformly similar between 40 and 45% for all of the 5 race ethnic groups. Obese, again, there was a nice split with the South Asians being in the middle. About 30% are obese if you use the correct cut point of 27.5. Chinese had the lowest prevalence of obesity. So let's focus in on this normal weight group, because this is the group that in clinical terms, people of normal BMI often get ignored a little bit, or felt to be fine and don't need any special screening or special attention. So we really wanted to focus in on them. And so here, looking at people in normal weight, we split them into who is metabolically abnormal in the red dots versus metabolically normal with the blue dots. And here you can see the South Asians had a very high prevalence of metabolic abnormalities. Almost 45% were metabolically abnormal, even with a normal BMI, higher than the other groups. And so looking at this a little bit more, we wanted to understand what BMI equivalent would a South Asian be to have the same metabolic risk as a white American with a BMI of 25. And so when we did this extrapolation, so here's the white individuals with a BMI of 25, the prevalence of metabolic abnormalities is about 30%. Yet for the South Asian individuals, they reach that 30% mark with a BMI of 19.6. You can see that it's lower for every other ethnic group, with Chinese being close behind South Asians at 20.9. So what I'm trying to say here is that a low BMI is not something to think is protective in Asians, especially in South Asians, and that we need to be aggressive in our screening for diabetes, for cholesterol, for other, hypertension, for other cardiovascular risk factors, and not give them a pass. And why is that? So we've known about this body mass index and body fatness paradox for a while. This is the Yudkin-Yajnik paradox. So this is Dr. Yudkin from England, who has a BMI of 22, and his colleague, Dr. Yajnik from North India, Pune, who has the same BMI of 22, but when you do a whole body DEXA scan, you can see the clear differences in body fat, 9% in the European man and 21% in the South Asian man. So in MASALA, we really wanted to look at, hidden fat stores in the muscle, in the liver, in visceral adipose tissue, as well as around the heart. So we used our CT scans to measure these fat depots. And here you can see we did an abdominal CT with a single slice, and the green shows you subcutaneous fat. The light blue shows you visceral fat. The light blue in here shows you intermuscular fat in the psoas muscles. And the liver, you can't use the same software. So we use regions of interest and look at hepatic attenuation, which is an inverse variable. And what we found when we compared South Asians to the MESA groups is South Asians store fat in all of the wrong places. And in terms of visceral fat, South Asians had higher visceral fat, and this is after adjusting for metabolic risk factors. They had higher intermuscular fat, they had higher fatty liver, and this is that inverse variable hepatic attenuation, and they had lower lean muscle mass than all of the other MESA groups. So, is this the reason that there may be so much diabetes? And I will show you our diabetes data. So in MASALA, 26% of the participants had type 2 diabetes. This is based on being on a diabetic medication already, or having a high fasting glucose greater than or equal to 126, or a high 2-hour glucose tolerance test greater than or equal to 200. A third were pre-diabetic and 42% normal. Comparing them to MESA, here we see men on the left, women on the right. The men in the South Asian men, 30% had diabetes. 37% had prediabetes, and you can compare to the other men. The men in MASALA definitely higher prevalence. The women in MASALA is very interesting. You'll see a gender difference by no matter which race ethnic group you look at, men always higher than women. This has been seen around the world, but I will just have you note the men in MASALA had 30% prevalence, whereas the women in MASALA had 15% prevalence, half. Compared to men. So that's quite interesting to us that women are, so much are better in terms of their diabetes prevalence than men, but still higher than other groups in MESA, not as high as the African Americans. But when we combine men and women together and we adjust for all other risk factors associated with diabetes, we see that there is this stark difference with the South Asians having much higher prevalence of diabetes compared to all other groups in MESA. So could it be those body composition variables that is driving this? So we did a model where we adjusted for visceral fat and hepatic fat and all of those other ectopic fat measures. And what we found here in this last panel here is this is the risk factor adjusted model with South Asians in black, showing you the high prevalence. When we adjust for body fat distribution with the CT measures, it brings down some of the differences, but there's still a big difference in terms of the prevalence of diabetes compared to other groups. So it doesn't completely explain why there's so much diabetes. So what is going on with this high risk of diabetes? So we looked at those without diabetes and adjusting for body size and age and sex. And we found that there's a lot more insulin resistance in the MASALA participants compared to the MESA groups. We also found that there's lower beta cell function. So the South Asians had much lower beta cell function compared to the other groups. And so it's not only an insulin resistance problem, as has been kind of promoted through the literature for the last 40 years, that South Asians are insulin resistance, and that's why there's so much diabetes and heart disease. There may be actually something else fundamentally pathophysiologically going on that makes the pancreas just not have enough beta cell function or insulin action early on. So we did another recent analysis comparing the different diabetes subtypes in MASALA, looking at MESA. So we took almost 1,300 of people with diabetes in both MESA and MASALA. So here you can see the numbers in each group with diabetes. And we looked at 5 variables: age, body mass index, hemoglobin A1C, insulin resistance by HOMA, and beta cell function. And we subtyped people into the type of diabetes they had. And we found that there were 5 clusters of diabetes. And that the largest cluster in MESA was older age at onset. And this is people who got diabetes as they grew much older, and they had the best metabolic control. The second highest cluster was severe hyperglycemia. And this is the most common group in South Asians. These had the worst metabolic control and the lowest amount of HOMA beta or beta cell function. The third group was an insulin resistant group with severe obesity, highest BMI, highest HOMA IR, as well as very high beta cell function. So their beta cells haven't exhausted yet. And then there were 2 other smaller groups, a young age at onset group and an insulin using group. And what I want to show you is that all 5 of these clusters exist in each and every one of the different race ethnic groups in MESA, and whites, blacks, Latinos, and Chinese. And here's the South Asian group. In comparison, you can see that we had fewer of the people in that older age of diabetes and many more in that severe hyperglycemia, beta cell exhaustion group. And also several people in that insulin resistant group, but much more in the severe beta cell exhaustion group. So what does that mean in terms of outcomes of diabetes? What we found is in terms of who develops incident Kidney disease, that was highest among Blacks and Hispanics, and it's really highest in the insulin using group. But in terms of incidence of developing new coronary atherosclerosis or calcium plaques in the arteries, was highest in the South Asians, lowest in the Chinese and Hispanic, and it was highest in that severe hyperglycemia group, that group here in orange, that had beta cell exhaustion, not insulin resistance. And so this is like a new finding and kind of a new change in the paradigm of what has been the thinking about what are drivers of cardiovascular disease. A couple slides quickly showing you rates of hypertension were high, but not the highest. South Asians were second high compared to the Blacks in MESA. Cholesterol, not impressive. The cholesterol results for South Asians were somewhat similar to all the other groups. LDL is not higher than most groups. HDL is not that much lower for Latinos and Chinese compared to South Asians. Triglycerides, not that much higher. So the cholesterol story is a little bit not so clear. We've done further analyses on subfractions that I don't have time to go into. So let's talk about atherosclerosis in the last few minutes here. So we use CT scans to look at coronary artery calcium, which is an early part of the process of atherosclerosis and the development of myocardial infarction. And what we found here in terms of median levels of CAC, men on the left, women on the right, the median CAC scores for whites in green and South Asians in red were very similar. There's no significant difference between these numbers between age 50 to age 80, very, very similar. But the other three groups in MESA had much lower CAC prevalence. For women, there's no significant difference. You'll see that the y-axis is very different here, going from 0 to 100 compared to 400. And for the women, there's actually no significant difference among all 5 of these race ethnic groups, very similarly tracking. So what about change in coronary artery calcium? We looked at who developed new calcium, who didn't have any at baseline, and also the progression of CAC over 5 years. And what we found is in terms of incidence of new CAC, similar picture again, where the whites in MESA and the South Asians have very similar incidence of new CAC in those who had no CAC at baseline, no difference among the women. And then we looked at progression. Now this is a super busy table, but I'm just gonna have you focus on the men who have CAC between 10 and 199. These people had the most progression, and the South Asians had higher levels of progression than the other 4 groups in MESA. And this is only age adjusted. So very interesting that those with CAC had faster progression among South Asian men. So we know that there's greater change in CAC in South Asian men, but when we adjust for the traditional risk factors like smoking and cholesterol and diabetes and hypertension, there was no difference between whites and South Asian men. And again, no difference for the women, and the risk factors were pretty much the same for CAC progression. So where are we going? We're looking at incident cardiovascular disease events. That's our long-term goal. It's a small study. It's going to take years to develop cardiovascular disease events in a cohort of 1,000 people. And so far, what we've done is analyze, what are early risk factors, and all of the traditional risk factors seem to be holding up for South Asians for sure, but there are several novel risk factors. And this is where I think we need to turn our attention to understand a little bit more about the biology and the physiology of cardiovascular disease. So MASALA has influenced guidelines for diabetes care in the US, defining a lower BMI cut point to start screening patients for diabetes at a BMI of 23. South Asians are now included in the American Heart Association cholesterol guidelines as a risk enhancing factor based on some of our early data. And so just summarizing, we found that South Asians have a higher prevalence of cardiometabolic disease risk factors, and this adverse body composition might be partially culprit. Screen South Asians for risk factors regardless of BMI. A low BMI is not protective. And there are that glass half full view on all of this is there are several modifiable risk factors. And I'm a big believer that DNA is not destiny, that we can absolutely prevent cardiovascular disease a prudent dietary pattern, especially a healthy plant-based diet, seems to be protective in terms of lower risk of incident diabetes. Exercise, we have a lot of work to do to increase exercise in a culturally acceptable way. Moderate traditional cultural beliefs, so that integration strategy seems to be healthier for cardiovascular risk factors than being very traditional. Anxiety and stress reduction definitely could be helpful as well. And we have found that this CAC progression is faster among South Asian men. So where are we going in the future? Right now, we are doing a lot of work looking at metabolomics, proteomics, and genomics in our participants. And we've also been looking at COVID and long-term outcomes, combining with other cohorts in the US. We're doing whole genome sequencing. We've started a pilot study looking at second-generation South Asians in Chicago, and I have a few other grants cooking right now. So we're very excited about how we can grow in different directions. I invite you to check out our website to look at our papers. We share all of our data with anyone who wants to analyze data, do kind of a novel analysis. It's a very transparent policy. I'm going to stop and thank our participants and all of the investigators and staff and researchers who've helped us with MASALA. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That's really a tour de force. Dr. Kanaya's MASALA study, I think, really underscored the fact that you need to actually study the different groups separately, right? In terms of comparison, you can't just say that all the risk factors are the same, or all the mechanisms of disease are the same. And we see some of these, in fact, playing out, in real life, because in terms of our patients, looking after them, we know that they have different trajectories and different profile in terms of metabolic syndrome. Just so wonderful, but so many surprises at the same time. And so certainly the acculturation aspect is very unique. That was something I didn't expect, and also in terms of some of the metabolic patterns as well. Yeah, so congratulations, this is so exciting. Now, while questions may be coming in, maybe I can start out. I have so many. Yeah, so one is, you showed a really interesting data on the fact that the fat distribution is actually quite different and seemed to be, sort of kind of embedded almost, in the different organs and at a fairly early stage. Is this, dietary related? Is this just too much high-tech work, by all these smart people? What's the explanation for that? Because that seemed to be fairly fundamental in terms of driving some of these unique profiles. Yeah.
No, I do. So there's a hypothesis called the Adipose overflow hypothesis, which I believe in. It's still a hypothesis, hasn't been proven, but it's basically like any extra fat that you gain above and beyond what you really need to be for your body set point. Ends up going in, unfortunately doesn't go subcutaneously, which is the healthy place to put fat. It goes into these ectopic fat spaces. And other people have shown that not only is there a problem with multiplying fat cells, but the enlargement of fat cells is a problem, where South Asians tend to hypertrophy rather than have hyperplasia of fat cells. So I think there may be genetic underpinnings for this. But the bottom line is that if there wasn't extra need to deposit fat because people were, exercising, eating a healthy diet, moving, and not storing excess energy stores, we wouldn't have as much ectopic fat. So people in the very low BMI of MASALA have less of this ectopic fat deposition. So we know there's something you can do about it, right? By really working on getting that BMI as near normal. What is normal? Maybe 19.6 is like the goal, and that may seem unreasonable to tell people who we take care of that get your BMI under 20, but that seems to be where the data shows that that's where the metabolic abnormalities start to pick up.
Right. Yeah. So knowing that can actually have impact in terms of the kind of the risk modification strategy. So we have questions coming in. For example, questions on how to separate the impact of cultural integration from the dietary, sort of changes, and are these independent, or in fact they are linked?
Yeah, no, so we can adjust for the dietary patterns and acculturation together, and so we find that there are independent effects of the acculturation beyond diet, beyond physical activity. We know those are two big drivers of why we think that the people in that integration or even the assimilation class have lower cardiometabolic risk, but they're not the only reasons. And I think that there are several other unexplored dimensions of acculturation, such as stress, acculturative stress, such as other mental health issues, anxiety and depression, and things that can come with having that stress of not fitting in, of being discriminated against. I mean, these are real things that I'm sure that South Asians and other immigrant groups experience around the world, right? And we've seen it heightened during COVID, unfortunately, in the United States for sure. I don't know about the experience in Canada, but yeah, so we can try to tease them apart. Diet is a big part of acculturation, but not the only part.
Yeah, and that is, really quite impressive, right? In terms of how big a component that actually runs. And we've done some of these immigrant data as well. And it's very interesting that certainly in the South Asian group, for example, those from Sri Lanka, and, particularly, with political, sort of challenges, as well as cultural challenges, seem to actually have much greater risk, for cardiovascular disease than those, who are from a much more stable, sort of background.
That was a really very exciting paper that came out of Canada. So yeah, I really appreciate that. I wish we had enough Sri Lankans in our study to be
right. Yes. Yeah. But it was striking. Yeah. And so very consistent. And another question, I guess, is kind of on many folks' mind, that is that, you have identified these risk factors, whether that's, sort of a behavioral or, stress oriented. Do you plan to do any, intervention,
we are
trials or anything like that?
No, we are absolutely. We're not doing them with MASALA participants. We want to keep that as a natural history kind of experiment, not a trial, just a cohort. But my co-PI at Northwestern, Dr. Nami Kandula, she's actually heading 2 different lifestyle interventions to prevent diabetes and cardiovascular disease, using many of the lessons learned in MASALA in terms of healthy plant-based diets, exercise, stress reduction, social interactions. I didn't show you our social networks data, but the biggest influencers on people's health are their adult children. Having adult children eat a healthy diet or exercise influences their older parents to do the same. So how can we use these, lessons learned into intervention? So she has Saheli and Sath, are 2 big NIH-funded trials that we're doing in South Asians in the Chicago area. So check them out. They're still underway, so there's no results available yet.
Oh, exciting. Yes. I was just going to ask about the social networks, because these are actually very important, in these communities. Question from Taish Coutinho, who actually, congratulate your, fantastic body of work, and also, kind of a go down memory lane in that, who both of your fellows at Mayo Clinic, and in terms of, so she mentioned that at that time, you folks did measure central obesity. And so I think her question is that, you demonstrate very nicely, in that the BMI parameters, will need to be adjusted, based on the ethnic groups. But does the central obesity have any role, in this population? And
so we've looked at waist circumference measures, we've looked at waist hip measures, we've looked at waist height measures. I think all of them are good. They're not as good as actually measuring visceral fat and liver fat. So when you use the CT scan measures, they're a lot stronger. So we have a paper that I didn't show the data for, but looking at people from exam 1 to exam 2 who developed diabetes or had any glycemic progression. And it looks like the measurement of visceral fat and hepatic fat was significantly and independently associated with those who went on to develop diabetes. And so, and waist and BMI were just not so important. So waist is unfortunately a very poor man's surrogate marker. It doesn't track that well. It's about 0.7 in terms of the correlation to hepatic fat and liver and visceral fat. Yeah. And if I had to put my money down on all of this, I think the main culprit is hepatic fat, and visceral fat is just another surrogate for hepatic fat. Yeah. And if we could find better ways of clinically measuring liver fat, whether it's ultrasound or FibroScan or one of these fatty liver indices, I think that may end up being the smarter thing to do in epidemiologic studies, is measure liver fat instead of waist circumference, which has all sorts of measurement errors and poor reproducibility.
Yeah, a very good point. So to follow up on that, yeah, so, in terms of, sort of non-alcoholic, liver disease, is that a major issue? And also, fascinating observation on decreased beta cell function. So are these linked? Are we talking about an inflammatory process? What's your thought on this? Yeah.
So my thought on this is that I think that there are probably reasons that came from the differences in how the culture changed from going into agrarian cultures. We've seen that South Asians used to actually be the tallest humans in that part of the world, even compared to Europeans. And then as the famines and the agrarian culture took place, the height of South Asians have really come down, and the beta cell mass as well. And so there's some evolutionary underpinnings for possibly having lower beta cell function. So even, South Asian children who are born to mothers have smaller body sizes, but greater body fat, and also smaller pancreatic size. So there may be something evolutionary, not necessarily genetic, but more evolutionary, that is driving this beta cell failure at an early age, which is also predictive of incident CAC. And I think we've been kind of missing the boat by focusing so much on insulin resistance. Yes, that is a problem with obesity. And as we sit around and eat, heavier diets, we are having more insulin resistance, but there's this pathophysiologically, different thing going on with early beta cell exhaustion. And we need to figure out ways to, prevent that. And maybe that will be pharmaceutical methods. Maybe that'll be other lifestyle methods starting earlier in life to prevent exhaustion of the beta cells.
Yeah. So actually, come to my mind, GLP-1 agents, in fact, maybe more, sort of beneficial in this population. But it's fascinating that maybe, so slow environmental and societal changes, in fact, kind of pave the ground for all these, observation we see. And the question is, are there ways for us to kind of re-engineer that? Is that possible?
I know, exactly. And there may be toxic influences too, air pollution and other chemicals that are, toxically, influencing the beta cell function too. We haven't ruled all that out.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So maybe just one final question. This is actually more of a technical question. That is, you really, had so much rich data from this population. And how did you actually originally select your patient population? So is this, randomized group, or how do you actually
so we use surname sampling lists from the Bay Area and from the Chicago area to try to get kind of a random sample of people. That's what MESA was also doing, kind of random census-based sampling. So we don't call it a population-based study because we don't have exact population-based strata, but it's a community-based cohort. We did our best to do a random sample around these two areas. In future waves of the study, we added people, and now we're adding, another 1,100 people. We're going to be doing more of community-based methods, and we're going to be using weights to have the same population size estimates with the census tract. But the reason I think we have to move to a community-based is it's very, very, very hard to recruit some marginalized groups. Lower SES groups are very hard to recruit in the sampling methods that we've used originally. And that's why I think we ended up with a very highly skewed high SES, and that is the US population. But we had a lot of trouble having lower SES groups join the study, and now we're going to use fundamentally community-based approaches.
Yeah. And are there any other similar studies in other parts of the world? For example, do UK folks have a study or any other, you know, sort of,
well, the UK group has the UK Biobank, which is great, although it's a high SES, mostly Indian, South Asian population, so it has the same limitations as MASALA. There are other smaller cohorts that started a while ago, the SABRE study in South Hall, which is not currently accumulating new events as far as I know. They haven't published anything recently. There's a great study going on in India right now that we've partnered with, we've written papers with, called the CARS study, and it's in 2 regions in India, in Chennai, South India, and Delhi, North India. And so we're hoping to keep partnering with them, and they're going to be collecting measures of CAC and echo for heart failure, so we'll be able to compare prevalence. But when we've done these comparisons, the scary thing is the US prevalence in our study of diabetes is lower than what India is seeing now.
Oh my
For the
God.
first time, you know, it's flipped. Like immigrants have always had higher diabetes. Now the prevalence of diabetes in India is higher than our prevalence in MASALA, in our immigrants. So that is like canary in the coal mine, you know, the global implications are just, astounding.
Wow, so that's amazing. Yeah, because that was the question I had earlier, you know, in terms of the native population versus the diaspora, you know, how does this, you know, shift? And, but you're right, my goodness. Yeah, so things are changing, and the economy and, you know, sort of awareness of these factors are really, you know, kind of shifting very dramatically. And it's really kind of looking at the, you know, health in real time, you know, rather than kind of, you know, sort of a large retrospective, you know, look at what happened. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So unfortunately, time's run out, but this has just been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
And so it's such a thrill to actually have you finally here, you know, share the MASALA's results. It's so enlightening and generates so many thoughts and hypotheses, and you know, give us a really kind of a fresh perspective, right, on the condition that we always thought we actually knew about. But in fact, now we realize that in fact, there are way more, you know, sort of things that we need to learn. And it's studies like this that really actually help us to guide forward. And so it's a great pleasure. And I'm sure, you know, on behalf of the Agrawal family, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. And so I think what we'll do is we'll probably touch base with you down the road, you know, particularly investigators interested in this area. You know, myself, particularly from a heart failure point of view, you know, look forward to actually working with you on some of the collaborative studies. So wonderful.
Always open to collaboration, and anyone who's interested in using our data, please check out the website and submit an analysis plan. We're happy to share data.
Yeah, so thank you again. And thank everybody for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you again next week. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks again. Fantastic.